Welcome to We in Lewis, a podcast dedicated to celebrating the remarkable, creative, and energetic people who live in Lewis and are helping our community forge a collective soul as appealing as it is unique. These are their stories in their words. They are the We in Lewis. I'm your host, Kevin McGinnis. Our guest today is Dr. Kevin Mallinson, a retired university professor, lecturer, and popular public speaker. He has a PhD in nursing and has worked both in the States and in 7 African countries. Prior to his career in nursing and teaching, Kevin was the first openly gay professional firefighter in the United States. His is a story of courage, toughness, weathering endless homophobic assaults, some of which could easily have proved fatal. Today's episode is made possible by our new partner, Kinetic, with a K, a strategic communications firm that is renowned for creating innovative print and digital media solutions for organizations and nonprofits for more than 25 years. Led by founding partners Sam Shelton and Jeff Fabian, Kinetic is passionate about design and its powerful, positive influence on society. Its clients have included Ritz-Carlton, the Children's Hospital Foundation, and the National Institutes of Health's DASH eating program. Locally, they have worked with the Historic Book Festival, Lewis Line, and the BB Medical Center. For more information about Kinetic, visit kinetikdc.com. As you might expect, Kevin's interview covered so many topics and so much ground that we're going to release it in 2 parts. This episode, Part 1, will focus on his time as a professional firefighter. Part 2 will cover his nursing and teaching career, as well as his work around the country and overseas. Kevin, we're honored you'd be willing to join us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks very much, Kevin.
Well, let's start with the obvious. What led you to become a fireman?
Well, I was a 25-year-old young man living in the Florida Keys. It was a lovely place to be in the late 1970s. My partner and I had decided to build a house about 15 miles north of Key West, what they call the Saddle Bunch Keys. And I had been working as moving mobile homes. I worked doing a landscaping business, everything out in the sun. And I'm Irish English heritage, so I was getting a sunburn on a regular basis. I knew I needed to do something different, and I knew I needed a job that was going to have benefits and was stable. And so one day I was swimming outside our property, and the next door neighbor, or pretty much across the canal, mentioned a job had been opening up in the fire department. In fact, 3 of them. And I immediately thought, man, that is a job I would love to do. I'd love to be a firefighter. So it was from that moment on, I was just determined that that's what I would do. I went down to City Hall the very next day and said, how does one apply to the fire department? And it turns out you had to take a civil service exam. So I went ahead and did that and got interviewed for the fire department.
I believe your family has a history with firefighting. Is that right?
It does. Strangely enough, it wasn't until after I was a firefighter for a while that my sister reminded me of that. My parents were immigrants from England. They came over after World War II. So I never knew my grandparents. But we knew some stories, and we had some photographs. And one of them was of my grandfather, my mother's father, in Morley, England, in Yorkshire, had been the fire chief in the small town of Morley. During World War II, when London was being bombed, the firefighters from around the country were called to London to try to put out the fires and help manage all the tragedy. And so my grandfather went with most of the able-bodied men from the Morley Fire Department, leaving very few behind. My grandmother became the fire chief of the town. She had a department of mostly women and some men who weren't so able-bodied, and managed that for a couple of years before giving it back to my grandfather. So I do have photographs of both my grandmother and my grandfather in their fire uniforms. So I do have a history.
So it was in the blood, even if you weren't aware of it at the time.
That's correct.
When did you realize that your experience was going to involve a lot more than fighting fires?
About 5 minutes into arriving for my very first shift and standing in front of these shifts of men that were coming on and leaving that morning, being verbally attacked. And I realized, wow, this is not what I expected. I thought I would be a firefighter who would immediately start learning about firefighting in trucks and not about homophobia. As the day went on, I certainly did learn a bit more about the equipment in the trucks, but the really biggest surprise perhaps was that the firehouse was a very different environment than I'd ever seen before. I've often likened it to a rat cage where 4 or 5 alpha rats have all been put in together, and they just need to spend the rest of their life fighting it out.
But this is Key West. You would think that this would not be an issue in Key West.
That's what a lot of people say to me is, how could it be in Key West that they don't have gay firefighters? Well, first of all, this was 1981, so it was 44 years ago that I joined the fire department. However, it was also the time when Key West was moving from a very sleepy, actually economically run down, deteriorating town into a tourist attraction. And gay men and lesbians who'd come from other parts of the country particularly were a big part of that. They came in with money. The Navy personnel had been leaving town because of cutbacks in the Navy's budget. And so the gap was taken up pretty much by people who were buying old buildings for very little money and fixing them up and making new stores, new guest houses, new restaurants. And not all of them were gay men and lesbians, but by and large, they were the noticeable people who were making a difference. And then for the very first time, advertising to gay communities around the United States, come to Key West. It's a beautiful place to vacation. So this was the late 70s. And by the time I joined in 1981, the local people born and raised on the island of Key West, who are generally referred to as conks, conks were feeling threatened that houses and buildings that they had known for many, many years were now being transformed, and that suddenly there were gay men and lesbians like everywhere they went. In their mind, it was everywhere they went. So when I joined the fire department in 1981, it was almost confirming their fear that now gay men are going to start to infiltrate their institutions, the police force, the fire department, the healthcare system, etc. So it was a bit of a threat. And I have to balance that with how difficult it was for them to see their island change. But at the same time, they had not had good income, because when the Navy left, a lot of their jobs left. Suddenly, when gay men and lesbians are coming in and creating these new restaurants and other buildings, they needed plumbers, carpenters, electricians, roofers, which all happened to be the conks who lived on the island and who knew how to get the equipment and the materials that they needed to do these renovations. And they had the carpentry skills. So on one hand, they were feeling invaded on the island, and on the other hand, they were making more money than they'd made in decades.
But still, you were entering, unbeknownst to you, sort of a bastion.
Yes, unbeknownst to me. Nowhere in the literature does it say that firefighters have this fraternal family. I'd call it an organization. It is an organization, but it's a paramilitary fraternal family. And in many, many firehouses to this day in the United States, when new firefighters are hired, it is often someone's brother, their cousin, their nephew. So they keep it in the family. By and large, they keep it white. All right, so 94% of all firefighters and professional firefighters in the United States are white. They are 96% male. So very few women have actually been able to break in over all these years. But at the same time, they also wanted people of their own kind and not outsiders, not people who were different. I appeared to be a bit different to them.
Did they know anything about you on the day you arrived?
They did. Actually, it turns out they knew about me minutes after taking the civil service exam. I went into City Hall to take a general civil service exam, which you had to do. You had to have a high school diploma in order to be a firefighter. I'd already had 2.5 years of college. But I sat down for the civil service exam, and in the room were 20-something other guys. And they were all talking to each other. Nobody talked to me. I didn't know any of them. And afterwards, the registrar who had been there monitoring was scoring every exam as it went along. So at the very end, he told us all to wait. And then he calls me up and he says, "Mallinson, you got the highest score on the exam today. Congratulations." And I said, "Oh, great. No big deal." But then he says, "No, that's important because the chief has to interview at least 3 men for the fire department. So you're sure to be one of the 3. That was important information I didn't realize I needed to know. But it turns out, I found out a year later, that during the civil service exam, firefighters had come into the room. The fire station was right next to City Hall, one of them. And they looked around the room and they said, "Hey, there's Carlos. He's so-and-so's brother-in-law. Hey, there's Thomas. There's whatever. Who's that guy?" Nobody knew who I was. So they went to the registrar's table and they said, "Who's that guy?" Mallinson. He lives at Bay Point, so an island 15 miles north of Key West. So they called the firefighter who lived across the canal from me and said, "Hey, Louie, do you know this guy Mallinson, Kevin? He's taking the civil service exam." Louie lied and said, "Never heard of him."
And was it Louis the reason?
Louie's the reason why I applied for the job in the first place. But now that I had the gall to actually go apply for the fire department, he was now scared. And so he said, "No, I don't know him. I don't know him." So they ended up calling, while I'm in the exam, the chief's ex-wife, Elsie, who also lived on the island. And from what I heard, her comment was, "Oh, yeah, he's a faggot. He and his friend are building a house right down the road from me." So they knew that before I even finished the civil service exam. So a week later, I come for a physical agility test and interview, and then a week after that, my very first day in the firehouse. 3 of us were called to the firehouse, fire station number 1, by the chief and the assistant chief, and it was to interview us to see if we would fit in the fire department, and then to do physical agility tests. Well, no big deal. So I get there. The interview was all of 5 minutes. I mean, it was absurd. It was so short. I think they just wanted to make sure you had a pulse. And so after the 3 of us did that, they took us to the football field next door and had us run laps around the field. So we had to do 5 laps running around to show that we physically could do it. And then after that, you had to grab 2 big fire hoses and somehow carry them up 4 flights of stairs to the top of a structure that was there overseeing the football field. Well, in those days, I was running on average 10 miles a day. I was involved with the Runners Club on the island, a race director for the Runners Club, and so 5 laps was a cinch for me. As I was finishing my second lap, I think the other 2, John and Johnny, the other 2 recruits, were not even finishing lap 1 yet. Both of them very physically strong with their arms, but they were not flexible. They had no cardiovascular conditioning whatsoever. So they struggled with these 5 laps. Meanwhile, I finished the 5 laps, grabbed the hoses, run up to the top of the tower. So I had plenty of time to wait while they eventually got it done. Then we get taken into the firehouse itself. And now there's 3 firefighters who are on duty that are all in the truck bay. And what we had to do was take one of the firefighter masks that you wear when you go into a fire, very much like a scuba diving mask, if you will, except it covers your entire face. And it has an air hose that goes to an air tank in the back. Well, for this particular exercise, they didn't connect it to a tank. They just had the air hose hanging, and you were breathing through the mask through that air hose. The test was that one of the firefighters was going to block off the end of the air hose so that you could not breathe air through. And you had to stay like that and keep the mask on for 45 seconds. And if you couldn't do that, if you panicked and you pulled your mask off to breathe, you failed, essentially. So the assistant chief says, okay, go. He starts his timer. Each of the 3 firefighters takes each one of us, blocks our hose. And it wasn't all that bad. It's uncomfortable, but especially since you're not used to having a mask on your face. But I was a scuba diver, so I just relaxed, took it easy, and said, I'll get through this. When it got to the 45 minutes, the assistant chief said, all right, take off. 45 seconds. I'm sorry. Take your thumb off. So immediately the 2 other guys let go of the hose and let their 2 guys start to breathe again. The guy holding my air hose keeps his thumb on the hose. And I'm thinking, I'm sure he said, let go. And he kept it there, and he kept it there to the point where the assistant chief finally yelled at him and said, I said, let that go. So I probably had another 10 to 15 seconds before they let it go. But I didn't pull the mask off, and I didn't panic. But that was the first time I thought, why did that happen? That's kind of odd. He should have let go like the other guys. When I arrived the next Monday for my very first shift, which is 7 a.m. to 7 a.m. It's a 24-hour shift. Then you get 48 hours off. And that's how the schedule generally went for us. So I arrived for my first 24-hour shift, walk into the firehouse, find the captain, introduce myself. We're having a cup of coffee, and there's suddenly more men in the room than should be because shifts aren't this big. And I get verbally attacked. One of the very first things someone says to me is, we heard you're a faggot. I was shocked. Like, what? And my first thought was, what? Like, what does this have to do with anything? But then I looked at him in disbelief. And all the other men are watching intently. And I looked at him in disbelief and said, what? Who the heck would ever say that? And for just a moment, he thought maybe he'd made a mistake. And he says, we heard you're a goddamn faggot. And I said, I can't imagine anybody saying that about me. He still looked confused. They all looked very uncomfortable. And then he says, aren't you building a house at Bay Point? And I said, yes. With another guy? Yes, with my partner, Joe. He looked very confused, like he had too many mental balls to juggle, and he couldn't do that all at one time. And he says, well, then you're a faggot. And I said, no, that means I'm a gay man. And then I looked up and I said, I can't imagine anybody calling me a faggot. And it was so tense in the room. And I turned to the captain and said, hey, I haven't had a chance to look at the trucks yet, so I'm going to go downstairs and look at them. And I left the room. And that was pretty much how I decided I was going to handle this homophobia. But right on that very first day, one of the guys comes down to the truck bay, pushes me up against the concrete wall, and says, this isn't a place for faggots. We have no queers in the firehouse. So it turns out they expected that at that first shift, I would be so horrified and so scared that I would never come back again. So you can imagine their surprise when I showed up a few days later for my second shift. And they were like, holy crap, he actually came back. From that day on, for the next 4 years, they never, ever missed a day of work without harassing me somehow. Whether it was physically threatening me, pushing me up against the wall, destroying some of my personal equipment, but constantly referring to faggots and pansies and queers and punks and any other word that they could come up with. And I just decided, I'm not going to let the words bother me. So I'd been in the department about 6 months, and the chief sent somebody upstairs. We were on the second floor in our living quarters, and said, Mallinson, the chief wants to see you in his office right now. Okay, that's fine. So I got myself together, went down to chief. The chief doesn't really request to see firefighters very often. And I walked in the office, and there was Oscar in the office. He was a fellow firefighter on my watch. Oscar was about 6'2", maybe 200 and something pounds. The first black man ever hired in the Key West Fire Department. Now, this is 1982 by this time. The first black man hired was still working in the department. Not a very pleasant man whatsoever. And so the chief then turns to Oscar after I sat down and says, tell him what you told me. And so Oscar proceeds to talk about how I was sexually harassing him and making him feel uncomfortable. Now, for everyone to understand, I was 130 pounds. At my tallest, I was 5'8.5". And this towering man over me, I was sexually harassing him. Really? In what way? And he said, well, when you go by me at the couch, you take your hand and you rub it across the back of my neck and my head. It makes me very uncomfortable. And, you look at me all the time. And I thought, this is ridiculous. So immediately in my head, I'm thinking, okay, so he's just doing this to get rid of me. He wants me off this shift is kind of what I thought. And so when he finished he was so uncomfortable. He was stumbling over his words. He couldn't quite get the story out in the way that he wanted. So when he finished, I turned to the chief and I said, Chief, do you believe a word of that? And the chief said, no, actually I don't. Oscar, get out of here. Go upstairs. Oscar looked shocked, but he left, closed the door. And the chief turned to me and he said, next week is your 6-month anniversary with the city. You become permanent at 6 months. You're probationary right now. That's why they got Oscar to do this. So he realized the other men had worked Oscar into doing this and claiming this. And he said, you need to keep your head down. And I said, well, Chief, they're just constantly harassing me. And the chief saw it. He knew it all happened. I said, and I'm just doing my best to be a good firefighter. And the chief looked at me and said, well, I could fire you at any time. I said, yes, Chief, you could. And if you did, I would take you to court. And in those days, there were absolutely no laws to protect gay men and lesbians from employment discrimination. And I said, and if I lost in court, I'd take it to a higher court. And I would just keep going until I had the right to have this job, because I have a right as a citizen of Key West to have this job. And the chief leaned back in his chair. He had a funny smirk at his face, and he says, I believe you would do that. I said, oh, would you? So he repeated, keep your head down. He said, in another 10 days, you're going to head off to fire college, and that will give time for everything to cool down.
Was there also one incident where it wasn't just a verbal assault, where you were up on a ladder?
Yeah, absolutely. It was the Cuban Club fire. We go down there, it's dark, and we could see the fire from almost a mile away. The whole sky was lit red. So we get there, and I was part of my team, had to put up a ladder, go up about 2.5 stories, and get a hose into the attic space to try to cut down the fire before it got worse. So, not surprisingly, I was the one who grabbed the nozzle first and decided I would be the one to go up first. So I grab it and put it over my shoulder, and I'm climbing up the ladder. And I had learned already how to lock yourself into a ladder with your legs. You put your legs around the rungs in such a way that you can take your hands off the ladder and still be stable because your legs are holding you in place. So I get up to the top. They just begin to get the water into my hose and up to me so I can use the nozzle. And I get hit in the side of the face and the side of the body by a stream of water, which nearly knocks me off the ladder. And the only reason I stayed on the ladder is because my legs were locked in. So I was knocked off to the side and twisted and had to pull myself back. And I looked down, and clearly it's another shift, another watch from another station, thought it was funny to take their water hose and hit me while I'm 20, 25 feet above the ground on a ladder. They could very easily have killed me. Certainly they could have caused me great physical harm. And they're laughing. And I'm thinking, what is this? This is crazy. Well, I did find out after that happened several times over the years. They put my life in danger several times. They would say verbally, "We don't have your back." Probably one of the worst things a firefighter can ever say to another firefighter is, if you're in danger, we're not going to be there. We're not going to have your back. And this was one of those situations where they're actually putting me in danger of that. I heard nothing back from administration about it. I do understand years later, I found out that some of the firefighters went to the chief and said, that can't happen. That's dangerous. You can't be doing that. But imagine how scared I was to go home and tell my partner that they tried to kill me that day.
How did you not respond, except in the manner you did with words or comments? How did you not swing out? How did you not take the fire hose and just nail one of those guys?
Well, it's not that I didn't want to. There were a couple things. While I was in college, I had learned a little bit about demonstrating civil disobedience, nonviolent resistance. But living in the Florida Keys, my partner and I, one day were asked to go help two elderly women living on a different island with some problems they had around their cabin, around their house. And so, sure enough, they were lesbians, two women in their late 50s, early 60s. So we went up to Sugarloaf Key, and I met Barbara and Jane. And it was funny because they were just older women. I was 26 years old at this point. But Barbara was so easy to talk to. Barbara Deming was a gentle soul, very quiet. And it turns out that I'm fixing the toilet of a woman who knew Martin Luther King Jr., who did the march to Selma, Alabama, who went to Hanoi during the Vietnam War to try to broker peace, that had been arrested multiple times over the years to resist the war, or civil rights for blacks in the South. She was a white woman, came from a very wealthy family, but her whole life, her whole adult life, had pretty much been civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance. So through knowing Barbara over those couple of years, she would say to me, how do you want to respond to these firefighters? And my gut response was, I don't want to disrespect them. I mean, I could very easily say, oh, Nary, you fat pig, but I never did. I wanted to, never did. Instead, I would find ways to diffuse the situation as much as possible. And if I could do that with humor, that'd be great. But the personality I have is to reduce friction and try to clarify things if I can. But I'll give you an example of how I used humor. One day, O'Neary, who was this guy who just absolutely hated me and wanted me out of there, we're in the dining room one day, and he says, hey, Mallinson, I got a question for you. And so I turned around and said, what? And he says, are you the guy or the girl? So I looked at him with a query on my face. and said, "What?" As if I didn't know what he was asking. The other firefighters were gathering around because they were just dying to hear the answer to this question. And he says, "Well, when you're with your friend Joe, are you the guy or the girl?" And I looked up and I said out loud, "I didn't realize I had to make a choice." He looks angry and he says, "Of course you have to make a choice." And I said, "Nobody told me I had to make a choice." I said, I'll think about it. I'll get back to you." And I left the room. What confused them so much is my partner, Joe, was the construction manager for the cable company. So Joe was 6 foot tall, wore big, heavy construction boots every day and jeans. And he was in charge of 12, 14 other guys, depending on the day. But it was all construction. And so in their mind, they're thinking gay men have to either be a boy or a girl. And, well, this guy's fighting fires, but his partner is in construction gear. So that confused them. And part of my approach was, good for them. Let them be confused. It's an inappropriate question anyway. But rather than yelling at them and telling them what a stupid question or it's none of your damn business, I would twist it and leave them confused. And it was a great way to diffuse the anger most of the time.
Did you ever think about leaving?
Not once. No, not until years later when I finally did leave the fire department. I never thought about leaving. And it was because every job I had had up to that point, remember, it was the late 70s, early 80s. There weren't very many openly gay people. And every job I was in, people would ask, "Oh, you married? Do you have a girlfriend?" And I said, "Well, actually, I have a boyfriend." Oh, there'd always be this silence. People were uncomfortable at work for maybe a day or 2 or 3, but then they'd say, "Hey, Kevin, could you grab that folder and bring it up to?" "Yeah, sure." I mean, eventually they just forgot about it or it didn't interest them. So I thought it would be the same thing here. I thought after a couple of weeks, they would just get over it and just start treating me like a firefighter, which is what my job was. And they were spending 24 hours with me every time we had a shift. So it wasn't like they didn't know who I was. What they didn't expect is, as one of my lieutenants would say, "These guys never expected you, Kevin." Well, they didn't expect that I would be so assertive, but they also didn't expect I would be so boring. I never once wore a boa to the firehouse. Because of the day and time, and not that it's terribly different today, but whenever they saw me with Joe and I never touched, never held hands, never hugged, certainly never kissed. So they never saw any affection between us because that would just open you up to being physically attacked. So I was pretty boring to them because by and large, I'm like a guy.
Did you have an experience, kind of puts a pin on this, with someone who had heard that you knew sign language?
I did. At the time, I was occasionally teaching a course out at the community college in American Sign Language. I had learned sign language when I was 18 years old, became an interpreter, and paid my way through college by interpreting for deaf students. So I would occasionally go out to the college and teach a course. And one day, this beautiful blonde woman shows up named Karen. And one of my lieutenants drove a cab, and he was the second black man ever hired in the department. Very funny man, good friend of mine. He drives her up in the cab and says, "Here's the guy you're looking for." And so she comes up to me. I'm sitting in my fire uniform on the bench outside the firehouse, and she introduces herself, and I'm thinking, who is she? And she said, "Well, I need to learn sign language. I'm here for 2 weeks." And I thought, you must be kidding. So this woman was a writer for Saturday Night Live. This is around 1982 to 83. And funny, smart, certainly beautiful. We're sitting on the bench, and she says, I gave up a child when I was a kid. I had a baby, gave it up at birth. That child is now 21 years old. He's working for a law office, and he's deaf. But he found me. He found who his birth mother was, and I'm supposed to meet him when I get back from this vacation in New York. And I need to learn sign language. I thought, that you really don't learn it in 2 weeks. It's like a whole language. But she was so engaging and so funny. And she said, well, at least I can learn how to say hello, introduce myself. And I said, absolutely. Some of that we could certainly do. I said, I work here 24 hours, but then I get 48 hours off. So we could find some time. And she said, well, I'll pay you handsomely for it, which, that perked up my ears. That was nice. So while I'm there talking to her, I walk into the firehouse to get something. When I come back out, Oscar, the guy who had accused me of sexual harassment, was chatting her up. It's like, get the hell away from this woman. So as soon as I came back, he disappeared. But as soon as she left, got in the cab and went down to her hotel, I told her I'd meet her in the next morning at breakfast. Immediately, the guys start with, so who's the blonde? Where'd she come from? Is she like one of your friends? And one of the guys says, does Joe know about her? And I looked at him and I said, Joe knows what Joe needs to know. And just left it at that.
Oh, wow.
And so one of the guys at one point says, you wouldn't know what to do with a woman if you'd gotten one. And I looked him right in the eye and said, what makes you think gay men don't have sex with women? I mean, it's just one of those stereotypes that people believe. Like, why do you think that? So that was a topic of conversation for the whole 2 weeks that she was in town, because somebody else from one of the other firehouses calls me on the phone. Not a friendly call. We saw your motorcycle down at the Pier House the other night, and you were with some woman sitting at dinner. And I thought, oh my God, this is such a small island. And I said, yes, I was. And I hung up. Just leave them questioning constantly. But I have to say, she learned more sign language than I could possibly have imagined. To be a writer for Saturday Night Live, she would learn a couple signs and then put them together in a funny way and say, so would this mean, like apple of my eye? And I was like, oh my God. The way her brain worked, which was perfect, because she did learn enough to actually introduce herself and show that she made an effort in 2 weeks' time.
This sounds so exhausting to have to deal with all this stuff, to deal with not just with the physical, not the homophobic attacks, but also the questions. And you wrote a book called Alarm in the Firehouse. And you go into great deal, which we don't have time for, of all of the things that happened to you. But you were able, it seems, not just to be upset or angry, but to also get a glimpse of why these people were so afraid of you.
Yeah, I was always thinking to myself, why am I such a threat to these guys? And to give you sort of an idea, one of the things that they would say constantly is, stop talking about being gay. And I would say, excuse me, name one time when I brought it up, because I don't. They bring it up constantly. And when they do, then I assert myself, because I will not be ashamed of who I am. There was no reason for shame. I wrote a chapter in my book that was describing how I lived in and out of two communities. That when I was off duty outside the firehouse, I was just me. I was just doing the things I do. I volunteered. I taught at the college. I helped out my neighbors. I built a house. And I was a runner. The moment I walked in the firehouse, the stress was immediate. Will I be attacked verbally? Will I be attacked physically? So I had to balance that constantly. Now, one of the benefits is that I'm an optimist. I've always been an optimist. I find the best in everything I possibly can. And so I kept thinking, this will change, this will change. Just don't get hurt in the meantime. When was the most traumatizing thing? Was when they started to say they were going to hurt my partner, Joe. It was not Joe's decision for me to become a firefighter. It was mine. And I suddenly started to feel, if they attack him on a Saturday night out on the street, or do something to him while he's working, I'm going to feel forever guilty. So that was difficult. But I knew Joe could probably take care of himself. Joe was a Vietnam vet, and he was pretty good at physically defending himself.
Now, why was going to fire college so important?
Oh, fire college. Talk about anxiety producing. In the first year, you have to be, in those days, you had to be certified by the State Fire Marshal's office by going through training called fire college. And it's still called fire college to this day. What it is you travel 8 hours away to Ocala, Florida, and you're in boot camp, essentially, for 6 weeks. Except boot camp has burning buildings and buildings that you have to rappel off the 5th floor roof from, or put up a 50-foot ladder, or carry someone out of a burning building. So it's physically demanding for 6 weeks, but it's also psychologically demanding. And there are a lot of academics. One of the things I like to say to people when they say, "What do you mean academics?" is I say to them, define fire. What is fire? Well, most people have actually not ever thought of what fire is. They just think oxygen, you need fuel, you need what. There's a lot of academics. What's in a fire extinguisher? Did you know that there are 37 different types of fire extinguishers? And so some of them are for computers, some of them for wood. Well, we had to learn all of that in 6 weeks while getting up every morning at 5 a.m, getting out on that football field, doing our laps, and then starting to fight fires through the day. So if you don't pass and you're sent home because you failed, you get a second chance. It was made clear to me that if I failed the first time, the chief would not give me a second chance, because that would be their out to get rid of me and say you're fired because you didn't get certified. So in 1982, in the spring, I got on my motorcycle and drove the 8 hours up to Ocala. John and Johnny, the two guys I'd been hired with, also went, but of course they didn't invite me to go in the truck with them, so they drove separately and in John's truck. So all three of us are attending fire college, and they told us the very first day, half of you won't be here after a week. There were 33 of us in the room, 32 men and 1 black woman. I thought, woo, good for you, honey. A week later, 19 had failed. So more than half the class had already failed. And they failed generally because they showed fear and ran out of a building, or they pulled their mask off in the middle of a fire scene. There were any number of things that they could have done wrong, not followed the orders of the, it's a paramilitary thing. So you have captains and lieutenants and instructors yelling and screaming at you. They wanted people who were able to be disciplined and remain through. So after the first week, John and Johnny from Key West fail and are sent home. And I stayed on. And I thought, oh, thank God. But now I'm kind of all by myself. Well, a day later, I get a message that Fido is coming up. He's a new hire in the department, and he's coming to fire college. And I'm thinking, Fido? Never heard of Fido. Well, his name was Adolfito. And Adolfito Rodriguez shows up, about 42 maybe years old, dumpy. And I'm thinking, oh my God, this guy is so physically unfit, he'll never make it. But it was really kind of funny in many different ways. It was a real turning point for me to have this happen, because John and Johnny had a motel room together that the city was paying for. I had my own room at the motel being paid for. But when John and Johnny failed, the chief was not going to pay for a whole nother room for a guy, so Fido had to share a room with me. And I thought, oh, this won't be pretty. This is not going to be easy. So when he arrived, I sat him down and I had a straight to the face talk with him and said, my being gay has nothing to do with anything. The only reason I'm here is to pass fire college, and you damn well better pass too. And I said, so don't think there's any problem with rooming with a gay guy, because it just won't happen. He appreciated that. And he said, no, I need this job for my family. I really need this job. I need to do this. So in the book, I describe how over the next 5 weeks, I browbeat him and taught him and mentored him and kicked him out of bed in the mornings to get moving. He passed. He lasted the next 5 weeks. So at the end of fire college, which was grueling, the 14 of us knew each other very well by the end of that 6 weeks. I ended up having the first place finish in the state that year. So I graduated number 1. First time Key West had ever had a firefighter graduate first in the state. So the fire marshal was very nice. I'll send this letter to your chief and, congratulations. And that letter never showed up in my personnel record. Chief never mentioned it to me. City has no record of it. The other funny thing that happened, though, is that as a paramilitary organization, one of the instructors, who I laughingly called Sarge, would stand there and yell and scream at us and force us into these very dangerous situations and to make us do what we're supposed to do. It turns out, and I describe in the book, that Sarge came out to me and said, I used to live in Key West. And he said, that 3 years nearly ruined my marriage, because his wife had come home at one point and found him in bed with a sailor. And it was like, whoo, okay. Interestingly enough, here it is decades later, he's still with his wife. And he is the rough, gruff Sarge at the fire college, which nobody knows anything about him other than me. It gave me sort of a safe place. And he said to me very clearly, do not tell anyone here at the fire college that you're gay, because you will be kicked out faster than lightning. Keep it to yourself.
And this happens throughout your experience. As you say, as you point out in the book, you find these people with all of this crap going around you. You find these people like Barbara, like Sarge, who help you at the most critical of times.
And I think part of that is being open to people. One thing that I've had through my entire life is I like people. I like diversity. So I will talk to people. Even when some of the firefighters were not nice, or a lot of the bystanders just really didn't take any kind of stand, I always treated them with respect. And when some of them were in crisis, I actually sat down with them and helped talk them through their crisis, because that's just who I am. So I think what that does is it engenders in other people the willingness to step forward and be supportive.
And Fito, who you just mentioned, later on when you met him,
he stood up for me.
He stood up for you and said you're the only reason he made it through fire college.
That's right. So here he is, a Cuban-American, which most of the department was Cuban-American. The black men were Bahamian heritage, but most of the men in the department were of Cuban heritage. So the very first day that I actually get the chance to drive the fire truck, which means I've been moved up into a semi-management position of a lieutenant for the day. I pull the fire truck up to the number 3 station. A bunch of the guys are hanging out, and one of the guys starts using homophobic slurs. And Fido, who was working at that station, then turns to him and says, don't you say anything about Kevin. I never would have made it through fire college if it wasn't for him. And I thought, oh my God, this is one of them standing up for me. It was great to see, but he was in his mid-40s, so at least he had a certain level of maturity to say, stand up for what's right.
And a lot of the men who are giving you the most problems in the firehouse, they didn't have to go to fire college. Is that right?
No, most of them had been grandfathered in before the requirement was there. And quite honestly, they would never have survived it, psychologically or physically.
Tell us about your last fire.
My last fire. So I had decided I was going to leave the fire department and go to nursing school. So I had put in my 2 weeks notice. The chief knew it was coming. And we had a new chief by this time. And I was on a shift of men now for the last 2 years that was really much nicer, much better. We laughed and worked together well. So I was going to get off duty at 7 o'clock in the morning for my final shift. And at 6 o'clock, 1 hour before, the alarm goes off. And it was an alarm for all firefighters in the city. So we knew, this is a bad one. So as we leave our station, we're a good 1.5 miles from where the fire is. And like before, you could see the glow in the sky. You knew this was going to be a big fire. We get down there. It is a very large bed and breakfast, a guest house, as we used to call them, on Truman Avenue at Elizabeth Street, right across from where St. Mary's Church is. And this very large Victorian house is fully engulfed in flames. So much so that you can barely get 30 to 40 feet close to it, and the radiated heat is just far too hot. But my captain and I were assigned to go to the side street, Elizabeth Street, which was closer than anybody else to the fire, because there was an LP gas tank in the backyard, a very large LP gas tank to serve this bed and breakfast. And when a gas tank in a fire gets heated up, it needs to release gas in order to not explode, so the container itself doesn't explode. So it's a pressure release valve that goes off. And when it does, it releases gas, which of course immediately catches fire, and it's like a huge torch going. But if it got too hot and it could not release that gas, it would explode. And if it had, it would have taken half the neighborhood, and a whole bunch of us would have been dead. So my job and my captain's was to sit with a fire hose just on the LP gas tank. That was our entire job. So it was extraordinarily hot and lots of fumes and smoke, and we kept it on there and it kept blowing off gas. Next thing I know, I'm waking up in a hospital. What happened was we had been kept in that position for far too long, because normally a fire chief or assistant chief would rotate out the guys quickly and say, okay, you've been there for 10 minutes. Another team goes in, you cool down and switch out. They never switched us out. So I ended up having smoke inhalation, heat exhaustion, and apparently at some point just put down the hose and walked the streets, and somebody saw me and took me to the ambulance. My captain, on the other hand, had a heart attack. So he was in the emergency room being worked on because he was having an active heart attack at the time. It wasn't until years later, talking to some of the firefighters that are very active in the retirement community, their feeling was that they left me there purposely, that they just wanted to see if that last few moments in the fire department I could get hurt. So I always like to say to people that it just shows I went out in a blaze of glory. But I did have about 3 days of just severe confusion, trying to get over all that.
Even your last day?
Even my last day. The bad guys never, ever, ever gave up.
This marks the end of the first part of our interview with Kevin. Obviously, his is a remarkable story of courage, of standing up for yourself in the face of relentless cruelty, and never, ever responding with a fist. More of Kevin's story and internal struggles he survived are discussed, as we mentioned, in his book, Alarm in the Firehouse. We did not do justice to his story today, and I apologize for that, Kevin. Please read it. It's an eye-opening experience, extremely well told, and brutally honest. Kevin, how can a listener get a copy of your book?
My book is available through Browse About Books in Rehoboth Beach, and also available on Amazon. Quite easily, just put in alarm in the firehouse.
And as I understand, it's also going to be available at Biblion.
Yeah, I think that I try to make it available, and so do friends of mine, in places where you might not find it usually. Now, my book is available also in the public library. Do not search for gay firefighter. You will get a list of things you do not want to find.
In the next episode, Kevin will walk us through becoming a nurse, earning a BSN from the University of Miami, and then his master's and PhD at Hopkins. He will share how he continued to apply what he learned and demonstrated as a firefighter to help and be an advocate of those who are often ignored. It's a remarkable story. Thanks for our partner today, Kinetic, who is helping make today's episode possible. They do good work for good people and develop courageous and unexpected opportunities for their clients. From here at podcast headquarters at the Bar Kindle, till next time, this has been We in Lewis, the podcast.